that to me is the power of community organizing, that power of going from one individual with a gripe to two individuals with a shared gripe that they're going to do something about, to 3 to 5 to 10 to hundreds and thousands of people who share a concern.
Thank you for having this interview with us and talking about your experience and sharing your experience with voting. I would love to hear more about what you do. Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Eileen Ma. I'm a voting rights attorney. I'm Asian American, Chinese American specifically. I'm queer. I use she, her pronouns. And I have been part of the Asian American social justice movement.
How did you get involved in that?
You know, the work of organizing is really just to try and make sure that communities, oftentimes communities who are marginalized and underrepresented, have an opportunity to change their own lives the way they see fit. Right? And to me, voting is a significant part of that.
I was really surprised to learn that there is a lot of voter suppression today. What goes into that? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
But we do see voter suppression happening currently in these modern day tactics, and they take the form of things like, first, barriers to registration, right? So trying to include extra steps for people to take if they want to register to vote. Like an example might be trying to require that people include some photocopy of ID when they fill out a registration form, something like that. They take the form of voter ID laws that require certain types of ID when you show up at the polling place. Oftentimes, if you restrict the kinds of ID that are required, that also restricts the community's ability to participate, because in part they might not know how to get certain types of ID, they might not generally need certain types of ID, and then there might be costs associated with getting particular types of ID. Other forms of vote suppression include reducing polling places and reducing polling hours, right? I think generally voting rights advocates believe that we should be making it easier to vote, right? That would be providing as many opportunities, days and hours to vote. In some states, you see a drastic reduction in the number of polling places. In addition, we see things like gerrymandering and vote dilution, and those are things that people often they've perhaps heard the term, but aren't thinking about it as much, because it includes sort of a little more technical maneuvering about how voter districts are drawn, how jurisdictions are drawn, right? And they can be drawn in a way that might actually reduce the power of an individual's vote, right? So that even though you might represent a majority in a particular community, the voting lines might be drawn in such a way that you will never be able to elect your candidate or vote your choice on a ballot because of the way those lines are drawn.
This election is definitely going to be very important for Asian Americans and Blacks, the BIPOC community entirely. What are some things that we can do to make sure that people's votes count and matter in this election?
First and most important thing we can do as individuals is to make sure first that each of us is registered and that we're actually on the voter rolls, right? The second thing we can do is talk to people in our circles. That includes friends, family, your neighbor, whatever your social network is. Be sure that you're talking to people about getting registered and actually voting. So taking that step and not taking it lightly, I think is perhaps the most important thing. And when I say, not taking it lightly, I actually mean make a list, make a list of who's in your community. Did I actually talk to them? What did they say? The one thing I want to add is that what I've heard a lot in talking to people is this idea, everyone is so upset, given the current political environment and given the attacks on people of color from this administration, everyone is going to vote, right? People are going to get out there and vote. Don't worry about it, right? But I think that we thought that in 2016 as well, right? That, of course, people are going to get out and vote because the options seem so dire. But, the voting rates in 2016 were similarly low, right? Where communities of color were voting, Asians and Latinos at around 50%, 50-ish%, and maybe in the Black community higher than that, but in the 60s. But that still leaves the 30, 40, nearly 50% of people who aren't getting out there and voting, and don't assume that somehow they're going to be touched, right, by social media or by others to get motivated to vote, right? Really, I think it's important this coming year for us to take that responsibility for ourselves, to say, I'm going to be the one to really make sure, right? Not just assume that people are going to get out to vote because of the circumstances.
Can you talk about the power of community organizing? If you're someone new to it, how can we get our start?
It's that kind of personal engagement, I think, that community organizing requires and allows for, that I find most inspiring. And so while the idea of it and the idea of campaigns and strategy and all of this that sort of is attached to community organizing, that can feel intimidating, I like to boil it down to sort of the one-on-one conversation, right? And to me, that's what community organizing ultimately is. And so it is, what is the conversation that we can have together that touches on both of our aspirations? And I'm thinking of, just two people, but obviously this conversation can happen with more people. But what can we talk about that's going to touch on our common interests and our shared goals for something different in our lives? And what can we do about that together?
Yeah, it does sound like it just starts with like a conversation and you build from there.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your organization and the work that you do and why you feel it's so important, especially for today?
Yeah, I work for Asian Americans Advancing Justice and the affiliate Asian Law Caucus. We do work in voting rights, immigrant justice, addressing addressing housing rights, addressing the national security state, and then voting rights is one of the projects we work on. So as an example, if in a particular county in Georgia, right, where I'm talking to you in June 2020, where Georgia just had a primary, if in that particular county, Asian Americans were not able to exercise their right to vote effectively because of either a county elections official or the Secretary of State's ineffective management, intentional or not, then our role would be to support the community groups in that area to try and do the advocacy necessary to make sure that the next time they're able to exercise their votes more effectively.
Can you talk about like instances of racial and discrimination that you've encountered and how it's personally impacted you? And what is the mindset that keeps you motivated and continuing on?
In one case, it was a boy in 5th grade calling me a chink, and just sort of running across the classroom calling me a chink. And the teacher was there, and there was no way to redress it. And I experienced, as many Asians do, the whole Chinese Japanese doing the thing with the eyes in school during that same time. And so that was my experience of being different. And then as I came into my own as a community organizer, and then came out as queer, as a lesbian, I think I understood further sort of the challenges of being different. And in some ways, I credit my sort of political understanding to the work of Audre Lorde. I think when I read Sister Outsider, a book which is sort of stands out as my favorite of all time, I really understood it is to be a queer woman of color in this country, and sort of how it's connected to all the forms of systemic racism and systemic kind of oppression that we experience. I think there's often a misconception about Asian Americans and the Asian American community that we don't get involved in stuff, or that we're passive or quiet, or we're not civically engaged, right? And I think that it's really important that we in our own community don't buy into that, because it suggests sort of really, it actually affirms stereotypes that are often sort of put upon us about how we aren't politically involved, don't care about the society at large, all we care about is ourselves, right? And that's certainly not my experience, and I think it's probably not the experience of most Asian Americans, right? I think we find that actually our community is very interested in what happens in this country and feels very invested in trying to make this country a better place for everybody. And so I think it's really important for us to reject those kinds of impressions, right? And actually, at some point, maybe even prove them wrong. Close with, or add, is just to please get registered and get excited about voting. You know, I think it's not just about voting, it's actually being excited and being a pusher on it or being being an evangelist about it. So that is what keeps me motivated.